I wanted to thank Isabel, though, for two things. She doesn't know this. This is what she created in color for the flyer that went out for this talk, and I thought it was beautiful. A huge improvement. This is the first talk I've had where the cover sheet had more than just the name of the presentation. So thank you. I also, I love the colors and everything. And I also wanted to thank her for having Robert Head do the talk about the British period in Florida for the Third on Third, because that lays out everything, if you were here, to give the background to this particular talk. So that's pretty cool. If you have not seen it, I was unfortunately out of town, so I watched it. It is a very interesting presentation. So we're going to talk about Mary Mattair, but first I have to ask you, how many people have heard of Mary Mattair? Okay, quite a few. And I think a large number of you are museum volunteers, so that may not be all of the docents talk about Mary Mattair. We say she was here, she did that, she did this. There are so many questions about this woman. Where did she come from? When and where was she born? That's not in our docent materials. How did she end up in Florida, only to lose her husband here? And how did she end up at Old Town, which is where she ended up? And how did she survive without her husband and two very young children? She was a very resourceful woman, that's what we know. When did she die and where is she buried? Unfortunately, I am not going to answer all of these questions because I don't have that information, but we'll do as much as we can, and I'll tell you why this is all so important to the place where you're sitting right now. What little we know of her early days was that Mary Green Mattair, her name was Mary Green. What?
Are you okay?
Oh, okay, I thought someone was commenting. And her husband Ezekiel came to East Florida sometime between 1773 and 1775. Probably from Glynn County, where St. Simon's Island is, middle coast of Georgia. There are ancestors of her in that area, and descendants of her also lived in that area and the Savannah area. So that's where we think she came from. We don't know when she was born or exactly where she was born. I did not go through Georgia records to see if that was locatable. I just didn't do that. Church documents record the birth of their oldest child, Louis, in Florida sometime between 1873 and 1875, but there were so few people here and so few churches that there are several different sources that say when Louis was born. Because if you're out in the wilderness in a cabin and your baby is born, it may not get registered for a year or 18 months. So there's not real good evidence about the birth of Louis. The family does, however, move to West Florida between 1775 and 77. There are census records that confirm that, and that's likely related to suggestions that Ezekiel was involved in Native American trading, possibly out of St. Augustine. But the evidence is a little sketchy on that. But one thing I want to point out about all of this, which was obvious when it was told, and David Head's presentation explained it much more fully. When I started as a docent in 2010, and we talked about the British period, you all, the Harrisons probably know this. I thought when Spain turned this land over to the British, at the end of the 7 Years' War, all these British came flooding in. I thought they came on boats from Britain, because no one ever said differently. But that wasn't the case. Many, many, many of them that came in the very late 1860s, but much more between 73 and 75, when Mary and Ezekiel came, were coming from North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia by the droves. Why were they leaving those three places? Does anybody know? The American Revolution was coming up and they knew it. They weren't sure. They were also pretty sure that the Americans were going to lose. Everyone was pretty sure in this period of time that this was just filibuster and fluff from the American colonists. They were British loyalists. Florida had become British in 1767. Oh, let's go down there and wait this thing out and see how it turns out. That's why Ezekiel and Mary came here. We don't know where they landed when they came to East Florida, though. We don't know that they came to Amelia Island. They probably did, but we don't know whether they stayed there. We don't know whether they went down as far as St. Augustine. All we know is that Lewis was born in those years. We do know they went to West Florida between 1775 and 1777. Go to the next page. Here's East and West Florida. It's a pointy stick. I promise I won't touch the television. Here's Glynn County. I outlined that. It is kind of a square, but that's my squiggly outline of Glynn County in what is now Georgia. Here's Amelia Island right there. Here's St. Augustine, and this is Pensacola. The dividing line between West Florida and East Florida was the Apalachicola River. They headed out to Pensacola. It was a very, very difficult trip. That is all Indian territory. There were no towns between Amelia Island / St. Augustine and Pensacola. You were headed out into the wilderness to get to Pensacola, and if you went a little further to Mobile. We think they landed in Pensacola first, but Ezekiel shows up in a census of Mobile, West Florida, not Alabama at the time. It's still part of West Florida, right over here. He shows up in a census of Mobile in 1783. The Treaty of Parrott, Mary does not show up in any 1783 census. We think the reason for that is that she was en route from West Florida back to East Florida. And why was that? Ezekiel disappears off the map after the 1783 census. Most likely he passed away in West Florida because she comes back as a widow with 2 children. How he died, we don't know. He was a native trader. He could have run into any kind of conflict with natives that would have ended his life. That was his livelihood, so that was a risk that he took. But another thing that also happened in 1771 was the attack by the Spanish on Pensacola. The Spanish took Pensacola back by attacking it, and according to John Head's discussion of that incursion, it was pretty impressive. They had built a fortress above the town of Pensacola, a redoubt, they're called in military terms, so they could shoot over the city towards the Spanish. One of the Spanish guns fired a shell that hit the redoubt and everything blew up, because that's where they were storing all the ammunition. If Ezekiel had been there, he might have died there. That's the other possible story, leaving Mary a widow. So Mary's return is a mystery. We don't know how she got there, whether she came with other people after the Spanish capture of Pensacola in 1781. And no, she moved, we know at that time, to Amelia Island. She shows up on Amelia Island. The Treaty of Florida in 1783, which ended the American Revolution, that treaty, I grew up in New England, and we think of the revolution is ending in like 1778 or 79. The final treaty in Paris was not signed until 1783, declaring the colonies independent and also giving Florida back to Spain. Two reasons that Florida was given back to Spain by the architects of the Second Treaty of Paris in 1783. Spain had supported us in the American Revolution, and we didn't want the British sitting in Florida. We were no army, no navy, just 13 colonies that had won an unlikely war. We had no resources left. So we wanted Britain out of Florida as a threat to us until we could get onto our feet. So Spain received Florida back in 1783. Mary shows up on Amelia Island, living on the bluff. If you've all been out there, the parade ground, there's the empty space at the end that overlooks the water. The fort used to be there. Fort was not even in anybody's dreams at this point. She was living on that land, right on the edge of the bluff. There is the proof of that is a document from 1807, a court deposition in 1807 in Fernandina related to a land grant, and not her land grant, someone else's. It had nothing to do with Mary Mattair, but the court deposition cites, and this is in quotes, Mary established on the land in 1784, now occupied by the encampment of the army, unquote. That puts her right on the bluff in 1784 with her two children. This supports the idea, and you can't prove it, but that was not her land. She has no land grant, she has no title, she's got nothing. She probably squatted on some other British family's land who had taken off to go back to Britain. That's the only story that to me makes sense. She had nothing. She'd just gotten back in 1781 from Pensacola, plus the trip. So in 1784, by the time she gets to Old Town, she goes, oh, this land looks good. No one's working here. It probably had a barn on it or something. So there she is. Many of the stories about Mary say that she was alone on Amelia Island. The census, I'll let Isabel correct this, the census was probably inaccurate and definitely not comprehensive. A number of other British families did stay. They had land, they had family, they didn't want to go back to Britain. They sure didn't want to go back to their homes in North or South Carolina where they wouldn't be welcomed. And the port was still very active, even if there wasn't a town or a functioning government or anything. There also, in one of the references I found, there was a very, very small Spanish garrison there, not on the land that Mary was on, a little bit to the north of it. They were overseeing, a small group, probably 10 or 20 soldiers, overseeing the exodus of all these British citizens who are now going to other parts of the world. So she's there sitting on the bluff. Change comes for them, and in 1784, the Spanish make an offer to Mary. She's still sitting on the bluff. They are now ready to garrison soldiers there. But there she sits. This little lady with two children. They offered her 200 acres in exchange for her 5. That's a pretty good deal. It was not, and it did say at the head of the island, which means right where the bluff is. No land grant exists that documents this exchange. It was a simple exchange. The exchange starts immediately after that with the construction of the military barracks that are referenced in that 1804 court deposition. There is now a military presence at the head of the island on the bluff. The fort that we know that was there and eventually fell into the water came years later. We're just talking about an encampment at this point. She gets 200 acres on Piney Island, and I'll show you where that is in a minute. It is not right across from Old Town. I always thought she got land right across from Old Town. She didn't. Her son Lewis also gets 200 acres, and I'm flummoxed by that. He's a kid still. He's not 18. I don't know how she wrangled that. But he also got a different 200 acres, further south than her land. That was called, as some of the docents know, El Naranjo. Naranjo means orange in Spanish. It was an orange grove primarily, but they farmed, they had vegetables, they had milk cows, they had some beef cows, and other goods. They became basically the Publix for Old Town. With 400 acres to work, they could feed most of the people who are now in Old Town. So she's got a good deal going. And I want to just then, this is the fun part. You can't see that very well, but I'm going to walk over here. This is a fabulous map, and we have one up here. This is the one I took a photo of. This is the original map, and we can look at those at the end. But these are the land grants that happened at that time. And I shouldn't say land grants yet. This is the land, the 200 acres that Mary Mattair got for her 5 acres up here at Old Town, right there. Below those 2 wiggles is Old Town. This is the one Lewis got.
It's off the island, right?
It's off the island, yeah. Here's the Nassau River going right down here.
Okay.
So I also want to point this one out because it also shows, this is Piney Island. This is Tiger Island, if you've ever kayaked or been out there. Over here is the large O'Neill grant. Those of you who've been around here know that this wasn't Yulee till much, much later. Here's the bridge over here. Bridge would be right about here. This used to be called O'Neill. The churches over there were called such and such O'Neill churches. So that doesn't have anything to my story, but add anything to the story. But people who know the old mainland part, that was O'Neill and was a grant over there. So we have the 2 Mattair pieces. There are some other pieces that we'll come back to later. She cultivates this land, and I found evidence of it in several legal documents, for 20 years until her death. And I say that because there are documents that say she died in the late 1780s. She did not die until sometime between 1803 and 1807. I don't know what year. There's no evidence. There's no burial. There's no church documents. There's nothing. But we know that she died between 1803 and 1807. She lived quite a while. So we now get the next character in this story. I'm going to talk about young Mary, her younger child. We'll come back to Lewis later. He doesn't play as big a part, but we'll come back to him. Mary, her younger child, her daughter, marries at 16 Domingo Fernandez. And Domingo Fernandez came to Amelia Island in 1786 at the age of 20. He was a gunboat captain in the Spanish Navy, and he also served as one of the harbor pilots helping ships get into the deep water port. He came from Galicia, Spain, as part of the Navy. He is very industrious, and every time he gets a promotion or whatever, he asks for land instead of a raise. So he begins to receive significant land grants for his services, and when he retired in 1800 from the Navy, he got a tremendous number of land grants because he promised to come and stay and help and continue the development. So he increased their acreage significantly. When Mary died between 1803 and 1807, her half of Naranjo, Lewis already had the other half, her half was divided between Lewis and Mary. Lewis moves to St. Augustine in the late 1790s. He's there, he buys land there, and he marries and has children. We know that. He kind of disappears from the picture at that point. However, he does not sell his Amelia Island lands back to Domingo Fernandez until 1820. The only reason I can think of for that is that he had people working his land, and he was using the income from his 200 acres plus half of the other 200 to begin his life with his family in St. Augustine. And at some point, being 1820, he sold all of that land to Domingo. Oops, wrong one. Okay, here's another part of this same map. I'm now looking at this part. Does this look familiar? Kind of like the city? On here, Domingo Fernandez, Domingo Fernandez, Domingo Fernandez. Down here, I can't quite explain these, I didn't go into this. Domingo Fernandez, Domingo Fernandez. He's got land all over the place. But this is the critical block. He has assembled enough land over there to now have the largest Spanish land grant plantation in the state of Florida. Mary has gotten, oh, I should have mentioned, Mary has gotten royal title to her land, which is an interesting thing in the Spanish rule in the area. I told you she didn't buy that land. It was a straight land exchange, the 200 acres she got over on Piney Island. She had to work that land for a certain number of years, stay there, be productive, take care of the land, and she could then apply for royal title from the Spanish government, which she did for her land in 1890. And in 1892, she was granted actual title, as was Lewis, to the land that they had been given 10 years earlier, or 8 years earlier. So anyway, that is what we're going to move on to now, the Yellow Bluff Plantation, which I said is the largest Spanish land grant plantation ever created in Florida. From this point on, I am going to talk about young Mary, Mary Mattair's daughter, as Maria, so as not to confuse you. She goes by Maria once she marries Domingo Fernandez. Her legal documents, including her will, which I'll get to later, the legal document actually says Mary or Maria in the legal document. So she knew how to keep things straight. One aside here, the Boscobello Cemetery, just because it's an interesting story. The city records of Fernandina say this was opened in 1798. We know Domingo donated some or all of the land for the Boscobello Cemetery. I didn't go far enough to see how much of it, but it was a very significant piece. But the other interesting parts about the Boscobello Cemetery, the oldest identifiable grave and gravestone with numbers on it is Peter Boisseau de Necar, 1813. And the cemetery opened in 1798. It is assumed, and the Boscobello Cemetery Association concurs, that there are probably many graves that are hidden and destroyed in the heavy woods, and it's very heavy trees, and what's that cane, or the one that grows so thickly, from this cemetery on the slope that rides down to where Old Town sits now. They think there are a number of graves in there that predate Mr. Boisseau de Necar, because the people in Old Town had to bury their dead somewhere, and it was probably up on that slope. And I don't have any further information about that because the dates I could find were a little bit inconsistent, but the city says it was opened in 1898. We know that Domingo Fernandez gave land for the cemetery, and probably at that time there were graves that were existing that people could go to that are now not able to be looked at because they're in such heavy woods. That ties in with the evidence that we have no idea where Mary Mattair is buried. but she had to have been buried on Amelia Island. It is probable or possible, I think probable, that she is among those headstones and graves that we have lost that are in the woods. It would be nice to get some LiDAR and go looking for things under the ground there, but I don't know if anyone would think it was important enough. But anyway, on to Yellow Bluff Plantation. This house wasn't there then. It comes back later in the story, so remember it. This is a house that is on the corner of 4th and Broome. And let me orient it if you're not familiar. This is 4th, going this way. So that house is there now. Across the street from it, across 4th, North 4th, is St. Michael's Church, right here, looking at this house, okay? So you know where you are? This is Broome. So I wanted to show you this corner because the main center household of Yellow Bluff Plantation, where Domingo and Maria lived, was on this block. This house wasn't there. There weren't any other houses. The plantation house was on North 4th, halfway between Broome and Calhoun, the next street up, if you're familiar with the block system there. The land on the plantation from Broome and Calhoun sloped all the way down to the river. They owned all that property down to the river, and that's where their docks were for their plantation. Domingo also had a summer cottage there, something or other. They called it a cottage. He was an amateur astronomer and would spend many evenings with his telescope down at the little house on the river looking at the stars. That was documented, so I thought that was pretty cool. The family burial plot at the time of the Yellow Bluff Plantation for the Fernandez family was across North 4th, but directly behind the house, in the center of the block. That's important. And there's no information on the house or anything else to do with the plantation, although one fact that comes up all the time when you look at this, that down near the dock on the Fernandez property was a well. And it is said that that well, and I don't know, I never asked Isabel about this, there was a well. And it was said that that well was the starting marker point for laying out everything that became Fernandina when Yulee did it. He started at that well. But I found that in several sources, but just an interesting fact. Okay. Things start to change again. Domingo and Maria have 4 children, only 3 live to adulthood. Don Domingo Fernandez, passes in 1833, Maria not till 1846. Maria does some very interesting stuff in her will. She leaves her land, split evenly with 2 exceptions, to John Villalonga, her son-in-law, married to her daughter Jane Cruz Fernandez, and George Stewart, her other son-in-law, married to Elizabeth Fernandez. And we'll get to the story later, but the beginning of the town of Fernandina happened when Villalonga and Stewart sell all that land to David Yulee's company. David Yulee wants that land to lay out the town you're sitting in, where he terminates his railroad at the port. He can't take his railroad up to Old Town. It's 25 feet higher. Train can't go 25 feet in a mile. My brother told me that. He's a train guy. They can only go 9, apparently. I trust my brother. He's a huge train guy. It's across the 1 mile marsh where the Rest Rock plant sits now. There was originally a walkway across that, so people had a shortcut from Old Town to Fernandina. And there's no room up there for offloading a train, terminals, warehouses, all of that. So he had to build the terminus of the train here. That's why he had to purchase the Villalonga and Stewart land in total. And remember, it's this big block right here. It looks just like not exactly now today, but the original boundaries of the city of Fernandina. So there's some interesting things about the will, and I want to read you a couple. As I said, she left the land divided in half to her 2 sons-in-law, but she left other stuff to John. John becomes a bigger player in the next few years. She leaves to him the Yellow Bluff settlement or plantation houses, household and kitchen furniture, outhouses, carts, wagons, boats, etc. I think she thought John would be the one to stay and run Yellow Bluff. George was living in Georgia at that time, so I think she thought he wasn't going to be the key player. John ended up going back and forth between Georgia and Amelia Island. To her son Stephen, who I haven't mentioned, she had the 2 daughters, Jane and Elizabeth. Her 3rd child that grew to adulthood was Stephen Fernandez. Nobody's ever heard of Stephen Fernandez. I didn't know she had a 3rd child. He was down in St. Augustine. To him, I bequeath to my son, Stephen D. Fernandez, the following Negroes, to wit, Carrie, Nancy, and Thomas. That's all she left to her son. No further information on that. The things that she excluded from, I don't have a slide on that, so I just have to tell you. What did she exclude from the will? She excluded 5 acres of land that she laid out that are out east of here to the, I'm sorry, they weren't bequeathed, that was my mistake. The will omits 5 acres that were sold by Maria Mattair in late 1830s to the United States. Why would the United States be buying 5 acres from Mary Mattair?
For the fort.
Fort Clinch.
Lighthouse.
Lighthouse. She waited till after Domingo died in 1833. I don't know why. Maybe that's when the U.S. government approached her. The lighthouse was moved in 1838, I believe. I think I have that somewhere in my notes, but I'm not going to look. She supplied the land to tear down the lighthouse on Cumberland. I don't know if you all knew that. That was taken apart brick by brick and rebuilt on Maria's land here. The other part, and you were wondering what the other part was. The other part that was excluded was the burial ground. That was the other piece of the land that was left out. One other interesting thing from her will that I want to read to you, and this name will come back, so I had to figure it out because I didn't know who this person was at the time I was reading the will. Maria bequeaths to Miss Manuela de Marche my mare Sally, or another of equal value. That's all it says. So I went to figure that out. That is John's aunt. John Villalonga's aunt got a horse. Families are just weird. So the Villalonga and Stewart families do keep the land for a while as a block and then eventually sell it to David Yulee. It seems unclear who's managing the plantation. John is the most active, but both of them seem to reside near Savannah, Florida. They're not counted in censuses here. So I think John is kind of in charge, but probably having someone else run the plantation for them. Just one more point on that. I looked at a lot of conveyances and a lot of deeds that were filed. One of the largest parcels was conveyed in 1851, legally filed in 1854. I don't know what takes lawyers 3 years to file, but it was sold in 1851 for $10 an acre. So for $5,400, so they were selling 540 acres to the Florida Town Improvement Committee. Has anyone heard of that? You have? That was Yuli's company. It was still a company town, so. But the Florida Town Improvement Committee, I thought that was an interesting name. So, we're now looking at the block that I was talking about. Here's North 4th and Broome again. We'll start there. This is Broome. This is North 4th. So these pictures are taken in the block that is bounded by North 4th and North 5th and Calhoun and Broome, that block. The southern part of the block, this, was deeded by the company for free to the Diocese of St. Augustine in 1870. The church was begun, there was a wooden church on the property, but the one you see here with the tabby over brick was actually begun in 1872, right after it was deeded by the Yulee Company to them. That's the south third of the block, I'm sorry. I'll go to the north third of the block, and this one's really interesting, and our next quarterly exhibit, right, Isabel, is about the sisters?
Scheduled for June.
June. That's right, we have the student exhibit coming first, and then information about the Sisters of St. Joseph. The north third of the block was deeded in 1874 to the sisters. They were originally called the Sisters of Mercy of Depuis, France. We know them as the Sisters of St. Joseph. These are the sisters that we know from the yellow fever epidemic and all of that other stuff. But this was again given to that sisterhood by the Yulee Company, not to the Diocese of St. Augustine. And they were probably not happy about that. But that continues on. The first classes in St. Joseph's Academy started in 1882, so they didn't waste any time. It was called St. Joseph's Academy. I learned in going through the records with Rhonda that this was started as a first floor on this end where the school was, and the second floor was added a few years later, probably when they had a chance to expand. The interesting part of it is the Sister of St. Joseph held on to this property until 1962. That was when they sold it to the Diocese of St. Augustine. I never knew that, and I'm a member of St. Michael's Church. The school closed in 1972, 10 years later, and this entire building almost got demolished. They hung on to it, and St. Michael's Academy finally opened in 1999, so it took quite a long time to turn this around when it was sold to the diocese in 1962 to become St. Michael's Academy in 1999. I thought that was pretty interesting. The center, 1/3 of this block, just about an acre, is the Fernandez Reserve. This is where it all comes to rest. There are 15 people. I need to see what my next slide is. Yeah. Okay, that's what I wanted. There are 15 people buried here. Domingo was the first in 1833. Maria was the second in 1846. The next person to be buried there actually was John and Jane Villalonga's son, Julius. He died He died in 1877. He died 1 year before his mother and 2 years before his father. He is the one who is buried under this huge, if I go back one slide, you can see how big it is. This is the Villalonga Memorial Tower, if you will. The interesting part is that that tower has no dates of birth or death of Julius Villalonga on it. I think the thought was, maybe, I really don't know, that when Jane and John died, maybe all of that would be put on the monument. It didn't happen. They have their own headstones. John and Jane. Also buried there, Elizabeth and George Stewart, Elizabeth the other daughter of Maria and Domingo, and 2 adult children. And here's Aunt Manuela. She got buried there too. They must have been very fond of Aunt Manuela. There are also 3 infants buried there that have no names, just dates. And I spent a lot of time talking to Rhonda about this, and I said, because I knew the dates of death. I'm sorry, they do have dates of death, just dates of death, no names. And I said, these dates don't make sense. They're like in the 1890s or something. They're not any of these people's children. Why are they there? Rhonda cleared it up for me, I think. I need to know other Southern kind of feedback on that. She thinks they are grandchildren of the families, the adult children of the 2, these couples. They might be their grandchildren who were died in Georgia and were buried here because at the time they died, this was the family burial plot. If that makes sense to people, I'm willing to accept it. Rhonda had no other explanation. There's no way to track them really because there are no names. They're just very tiny markers. They died at the age of 1 day to 18 months. So they were obviously infants lost very early. So the question on that is wide open. Now, I want you to turn around. I don't have to make a slide of this. Here are the Villalongas. We have Julius on the left, the son who died early, before his parents, then Jane, the daughter of Domingo and Maria, and John. Sorry, John Villalonga. And I was told, was it you, Thea, or someone else? When these portraits were donated to the museum, the order in which they were hung was specified. Oh. That is true, Thea? Specified. Let's talk for a minute about Julius first. I gotta see what this is. No, don't want to go there yet. As I mentioned, Julius died in 1877 at the age of 39. He predeceased both his parents. He enlisted in 1861 in the Civil War for the South, obviously. He was also a POW during the war and did sustain injuries before becoming a POW, which probably explains why he died at the age of 39. Things were not good for him after the Civil War. Jane Villalonga, as I mentioned, died in 1878, and John Villalonga died in 1880. His will was held in Nassau County, even though he primarily lived in Georgia. So his will was executed in the state of Florida. Now, I haven't talked much about their other child, John and Jane Villalonga's other child. And we're going to finish the talk talking about Julius's older sister, Leonilla. And the big question is, why is Leonilla's picture not up there? Nobody, who wouldn't fit? But there is no picture of Leonilla. She is the wild card in this group, and she is so much fun. She never married. She is the oldest child of John and Jane. She was born in 1833, quite a while before Julius. She grew up in Savannah, Georgia, indicating again that that was the home base for the Villalonga family. She eventually moved down here, I'm guessing in the mid to late 70s. And she would have lived somewhere, but at the point that the convent of the Sisters of St. Joseph was completed in 1784, she lived there. She lived with the sisters. As I said, never married. She had a private apartment over the kitchen, and she was there for quite a long time. We don't know all the details. She was the last one to be buried in the Fernandez Reserve. She lived until 1915, so she lived to quite an old age. She contributed extremely generously to the Sisters of St. Joseph and to St. Michael's Church. Now recall, she didn't get a dime in Mary Mattair's will, nor did she get anything in John and she got everything. I don't know if she was in the will of John and Jane Villalonga, but with her brother Julius having passed at a young age, she did get everything in the end. There was no doubt about that. She got everything in the end, and it was quite a lot. She spent most of it donating to the construction of the church. She paid for Italian Carrara marble for the altar in St. Michael's Church and the entire back altar. If you've ever been in the church, it is absolutely gorgeous Italian Carrara marble. There's also Carrara marble in the convent chapel, which is a very small space, but it's got Italian Carrara marble that Leah Nilla paid for. She goes by the name Nilla mostly, and she never married. She was known around town as kind of offbeat. The thing she did that really made her seem offbeat is she, whoops, what did I do? She adopted a child. This would have been in the 1870s, 1880s. Rather interesting. The young girl's name was Edith Gordon Hood. She adopted her. Even stranger was Bishop Curley of the Diocese of St. Augustine was the godfather. Made the godfather even though this child was 6 or 7 years old. She built the house. Remember the house I showed you earlier on the corner of 4th and Broome? She built that house. You can see it in this picture right here. Why did she build that house and move out of the convent? What the documents say is she built it for Edith to entertain. What does that mean? She was of marriageable age. Nilla didn't want her living in the convent with her. So she built that entire house just so that she could install herself and Edith in there so that Edith could find a husband. She was very eccentric, very strong-minded. She was well known around town from everything I understand, and lived a long and happy life. She was the last, as I said, to be buried in the reserve at the age of 71. She, however, before she died, set up a fund. I've seen the number $1,000. I've seen the number $1,500. Don't know which one's right. To, in perpetuity, care for the Fernandez Reserve, which is the middle third of that block. So that reserve is untouchable. That money is administered by the Diocese of St. Augustine, and it will remain that way forever. And there probably will be no other burials. Okay, now I have time to tell you my one great story about that. And some of you may have heard it. So I mentioned I'm a member of St. Michael's. When St. Michael's wanted to expand their church about 6 or 7 years ago, I don't remember the year, 6 or 8 years ago, they pushed the back, where the altar is, they pushed that back about 60 feet, and they put a transept there from side to side, which has more seats and then balcony seats above it, to expand the capacity of the church. Which was all fine and good until they went to the city commission with their plan and their plat and ready to have it approved, and the city commission, or whoever it is, the building group, said, nope, can't do it. And they said, what do you mean? They said, you have impinged on the Fernandez Reserve by 6 or 8 inches. This is a true story. It was in the paper. And they said, well, can't we buy it? Can't we get an easement? Can't we fix this? the answer to every question was no. This thing that Nilla set up is ironclad. There is no one else to ask, there's no one else to bribe, there's no one else to sell the land to them, to give an easement of 8 inches, so they had to redesign the cross transept of the church, thanks to Nilla Villanoga. Thea's going back there, woman power. So they did that, and I don't think the church looks any different, but that is now, that reserve, if we go back to it, go back to that one. The middle third of the block is the last remaining Spanish land grant in the state of Florida. It is still considered a Spanish land grant. So that's the end of my notes. Any questions about these interesting people? Now you know why. I love what you did about Mary Mattair and her lovely daughter Maria, who married Domingo and ended up creating the town we live in. Yes, sir.
Did Edith find a husband?
Pardon me?
Did Edith find a husband?
I don't have that information. That's yes, she did, but I don't know his name. She did marry, but I didn't look that up.
How old was Edith when she got adopted?
Around 7 or 8.
That was a 7.
Any other question? Yes.
Do you have any history of the child she adopted?
Not much. I didn't go into that. I think there probably is some, but I didn't go into that. He asked me if she married, and I do believe she did marry, but that was the purpose of the whole house. So, and she couldn't have been as weird as Leonella. So, hopefully not. Hopefully she found a husband if that's what she wanted. Otherwise, and she probably inherited all the money. So, in 1915, she got all the money. So that's a pretty good way to get married if you want to get married. Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming.